think we are live. Yeah, Animesh, we are live. I think we are live. Yeah, Animesh, we are live.
Yeah, okay, so cool. Let's start.
Yeah.
Okay. So, hello everyone. We are proud to have you in our DaeDarus hack and today's session. Today's session speakers is Logan Kilpatrick. He is an applied machine learning engineer as well as a Julia language community manager. Hi, Logan. We are great to have you.
Thanks. Yeah, super excited to be here. I think this will be an interesting talk, and excited to share with folks about Julia and talk about machine learning and sort of opportunities for students to get involved in all this excitement. So yeah, I think this will be great. I will push ahead with some of these slides unless you guys have any other comments or thoughts.
Animesh, I think you need to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, you were muted.
Sorry. So I was telling you that me and Arnav will go in a backstage and you can use the platform as you like it. If there is
Sure.
some question or a doubt on the YouTube channel, then it'll pop up.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Cool.
Sure.
Yeah, so we're going to go through and I'll sort of give a high-level overview of a lot of these different concepts in a second, but really quickly, I would say that if folks have questions or thoughts or want to make sort of conversation around any of the points that I bring up, happy to talk. I'd prefer to not just talk straight through. I'd love to hear some questions from folks and things like that. So feel free to put something into the comments and I'll do my best to answer whatever the question might be. So let's dive in and talk about some of these different ideas, and I'll sort of go through at a high level what Julia is, why you might want to use it, some of the things that I think make it the right tool in a lot of cases, and then lastly we'll talk about how students specifically can leverage Julia in their programming journey from a computing standpoint, but also from a career perspective. I think there's a lot of things that are unique about the Julia ecosystem that can help students out a ton. And is it possible to? Okay, cool. No, we're actually good. So I think this is a super fundamental question that I always think is worth asking for folks. When there really are just so many tools out there that exist. You have Python, you have MATLAB, you have some of these other more specific tools. You have R for data science in a lot of cases. So I definitely think it's worth taking a step back and sort of surveying the entire landscape and asking why we need another programming language. Because, it's not super trivial to go and learn a new language, build this entire ecosystem around it. And I've sort of felt that firsthand. It's a tremendous amount of work to be involved in helping build something like this. So it's worth asking why. And I think, if you look at the other alternatives that exist out there, it might become pretty clear, depending on how you're using those tools, why we need an alternative. And so I'll provide a little bit of commentary on this, but again, I would say the specific answer to this question may depend on your particular use case and sort of the problems that you're running into. But at a high level, you have a tool like MATLAB or something like that, and MATLAB is a sort of proprietary tool that you have to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's one of the challenges of MATLAB. And then you have, the performance challenges and all these other things. And those performance challenges carry through to R, they carry through to Python. So lots of sort of these broad strokes challenges across all these programming languages. And really, Julia was sort of built to help solve a lot of these different challenges. So let's dive into a little bit more detail around Julia as a language itself. Before we do that and talk about some of the specific like language attributes that I think make the language unique, again, I'll highlight some of these really key pieces. One of the, again, really important things from a design perspective when Julia was being created as a programming language was the notion of speed, speed and reproducibility. I think these two things are some of the key attributes that you would want to have when you're designing a language in the 21st century. And I think, Julia has both of these. The folks who created Julia back in 2012 understood that, hey, let's look at these existing tools. And one of the challenges with those existing tools was performance bottlenecks. You have a tool like Python, which is super high level and useful. And it's a great programming language for what it's built to do. But the reality is it's not built to do things really fast. So that's one of the challenges. And there's ways of working around that with some of the packages and things like that with Python and some of the other ones. So those are great tools as well. But fundamentally, the language isn't built for speed in mind, and Julia is. And again, there's also this reproducibility aspect. Julia, as a programming language, has this notion of reproducibility really baked into the design of the language, and this from a user of the language helps so much. I think one of the things that I find most challenging about programming in Python at a sort of industrial level is that the requirements.txt files just aren't enough to encapsulate the requirements of what's actually in the project. Like requirements.txt files just don't work sometimes. And Julia has sort of solved that problem in a unique way. And we can dive into that if folks are interested in what the implementation is of that, but something to think about. The other piece, again, that I think is so compelling about Julia right now is this growing community. Really, when I think in the context of the Python community or some of these other programming communities, you really don't have sort of a centralized community feel where, there's events to go to and things like that. There is to a certain extent, and maybe this is just my lack of perspective because I'm sort of not a member of those communities. I don't really feel it, but I consider myself a Python programmer, and I programmed in R before and all these other languages, and I've never really felt part of one of those communities. And I think that's partially because of the size, and that's partially because of how spread out everything is given the size of the language. But I really do think that the Julia community has done a nice job as we've sort of scaled up and sort of keeping that community feel alive. So I love that about Julia. I think it's a super compelling reason. And the last piece is this interoperability, and that's a mouthful to say, but this is sort of twofold. There's the interoperability between different pieces of Julia code, which is super important. You see this across the ecosystem all the time, and folks talk about this. You can write a machine learning package in Julia, and then you can go and write, some random marine biology package. And then just out of the box, because of the way that Julia is built as a language, you can bring these two things together and it will just work in a lot of cases. Sometimes, there's a little bit of extra work to rewrite your type or add some, special functions that make things function as you want. But in general, you can really just write different pieces of code in different domain. And Julia as a language, because of the structure, allows you to just bridge this gap really easily. And again, we can talk about some of those specific reasons why that's sort of enabled in the language. The other piece of the interoperability, and I'm gonna say it as many times as I can to practice with the word, but the other piece of that is working with other languages, actually. So Julia has really great support for putting C code into your Julia file, putting Python into your Julia file, bringing all these different languages inside of a single file. So if you have some really great Python code that you wrote, you're super proud of it, but you want to make the transition to writing something in Julia, you can do that. You can keep that Python code, you can invoke it directly inside of your Julia file, and then just continue the process and add some Julia code after that if you wanted to build a layer on top. So you have that interoperability, and it's something that I think is a great feature of the language. So again, if we talk at the high level as far as what the language from a features perspective provides. It's obviously open source. We talked about the reproducibility aspect before. It's from a design perspective, one of the core principles of the language when it was being built is that it needs to be fast in order to solve a lot of the problems that exist out there. And because of this speed, it makes it so that it's very well suited for data intensive problems. So when we talk in the context of data intensive problems, we're talking about, machine learning, AI, data science, sort of the hot topics in the field, quantum computing. Amazon is hiring a ton of people in the quantum computing space, and a lot of the tools that they're using are based around Julia, which is super interesting. So tons of really cutting edge stuff happening in the using Julia as sort of the tool for the job. The other nice part is that there's the familiar syntax. And I think this is super helpful for me because, in everyday life, like we really don't, like, I don't have enough time to go and like learn something completely different. And, I don't have time to go learn Fortran or something like that and really dive into a completely different programming language. And I think, coming from Python, coming from all these other languages, these higher level languages, transitioning to Julia is super easy. Like from a syntax standpoint, very similar to Python, you won't have too much of a challenge picking up the different pieces. So that's something that I always like to keep in mind. And then again, Julia is dynamic and composable, and this has a ton of implications for what we were talking about before with respect to the interoperability. So again, some high level ideas to keep in mind. So now that we sort of have seen what some of the features of the language are, I think it's important to talk about, where is Julia actually being used? What are some of the use cases? And I mentioned before Amazon quantum computing, which is definitely one of the things. And I'll make my caveat that I actually forget whether it's specifically quantum computing. I know a bunch of people doing quantum computing stuff using Julia. I just forget if they work at Amazon, but there's definitely a bunch of Amazon job posts looking for people who know how to program in Julia. So that's something to keep in mind. But one of the most compelling use cases for me is the Klima project. And the Klima project is this, it's a group of different institutions, Caltech, MIT, one of the groups at NASA and things like that. And all of these groups have come together to help solve this very fundamental problem of building climate models. And again, as one can imagine, building a climate model is very challenging because of the sort of complexity of it and also the scale at which you have to operate. So, if you want to build a climate model and this sort of goes back to the sort of ongoing joke in life as far as, why can we not predict the weather like tomorrow? You look at the weather forecast, they're like 40% chance that it's going to rain tomorrow. And again, they're giving their best guess, but the problem is that all of that stuff is extremely complicated. You're trying to model basically something the size of the entire planet, which is extremely difficult to do. So Julia is part of the stack that's being used to solve this problem. At the Klima project. And really Julia was chosen because of all the things that we've talked about before, because of the speed, because of the interoperability, because of the reproducibility. And it's really enabling this group to really help solve, one of the fundamental problems in climate change, which is actually understanding what the impact is of things happening on our planet. So if this is of interest to you, if you just Google Klima, you'll find the details to this, and a super interesting project to collaborate with and to find out more details about them. One of the other super interesting use cases for me, and I think this is one of the coolest ones. So there's a project called Pumas AI, and Pumas AI is doing a bunch of different things. I'll first note that the software that Pumas AI has created is a fundamental part of how Pfizer and Moderna were able to come up with the COVID-19 vaccine. So they're actually using Julia to power the pharmaceutical modeling platform that those companies use, which again, I think is super impressive, a super compelling use case for me. Literally, like that's the most relevant thing that I can think of as far as this technology being used, and the software that the people over at the Puma's AI team have written is sort of making use of all of these features within Julia, and it's again super cool. So that's one of the aspects of what Puma's AI is doing. The other piece of that that's shown on the screen here is personalized and precision healthcare. And what that means is, this is one of the interesting things about sort of medicine in general, is that, you go to the doctor's office, and this, just saying this out loud every time is so interesting to me. You go to the doctor, and, all of us on this live stream right now go to the doctor. We all get a prescription because we're having a challenge, whatever the health challenge is, and assuming we have the same symptoms, assuming we get the same prescription, it's most likely going to be for like the same dosage of the medicine. Like, they don't look at me and say, okay, because I'm 6'2" and 200 pounds, I should be getting a little bit more of this medicine or whatever. They don't do that, which is interesting, but that's just not the way that the doctor's offices operate, to my understanding. So I think this is one of the most compelling use cases, in that you can go to the doctor, make use of all of the software that the Puma's AI team has written, and they're able to actually personalize the dosage of medicines based on the specific traits of your body. And again, this makes perfect sense because, we all eat different food. We all exercise a different amount. We all sleep differently. We all do all these completely different things. We're all humans and people, but our everyday habits and what's happening inside of our bodies specifically is different for all of us. So it makes a ton of sense to have that sort of piece personalized to each individual. So this is, again, one of the cool things that the Puma's team is working on. And as you can imagine, it's a super complicated problem to solve. So I'm always wishing them the best of luck in solving these problems. But again, Julia is being used extensively at this organization. So hopefully all of this has sort of led you to the point where you're like, okay, Julia might be worth giving a try. I hope if I've sort of motivated everyone correctly that this will be the case, and folks are at least interested in taking a look and finding out more. So I think the sort of logical next step, if you've been convinced, perhaps not at all, you'll come around. I'm sure, if you just give me a little bit more time. So if you have been convinced and you're like, okay, I'm ready to get started, where can I go next to sort of take the first step into learning Julia? I think if you are interested in the sort of traditional classroom experience, MIT is actually sort of leading the charge in this case. The Julia project started at MIT back in 2012, and they've been doing an incredible job of sort of helping Julia, grow throughout the time. And I'm going to continue talking about MIT in a sec, but first answer some of these questions that are coming in. So Rohit is asking, what are the industry applications of Julia in the future? This is a great question. I think, some of the industry applications we were just talking about, climate modeling, healthcare. There's a lot of these different fields that Julia really shines through. Basically anything where Julia, or anything where it's a computationally intensive problem. Basically, if it's a difficult problem, and there's sort of a need for fast tools that will help solve the problem, Julia is the tool that I think will be the right thing. The other thing that I mentioned, which is sort of more future facing, is quantum computing. I think a lot of the quantum computing stuff is happening in Julia. There's a state-of-the-art quantum computing Julia package, which has won a bunch of awards that I've seen. So lots of super cool stuff happening in that space. And again, machine learning as well. We'll talk more about machine learning later on, just because it's fun to talk about and interesting. But something that's really cool and unique about the machine learning ecosystem in Julia is that, you have the sort of fundamental Julia machine learning package called Flux, Flux.jl, and Flux.jl sort of works really well. Again, this interoperability concept, it works really well with some of the other, packages that exist out there. So now we have things like machine learning plus differential equations, or machine learning plus, all these different domain-specific things, machine learning plus physics. And there's a bunch of really cool implications of sort of combining all of these different things together. So very exciting. How many domains can Julia help me with? Abhinav, you know what? This is a good question, but it depends on how many domains you're sort of working in. So I can't answer that question specifically without a little bit more context, but definitely a good question. Julia is applicable in a lot of domains. Again, it's a general purpose programming language. So anything you use, Python, MATLAB, R for, Julia is a candidate for all of those use cases. Julia is definitely a scripting language. So again, very similar to Python. The same sort of way that you would write a Python file is the way that you would write a Julia file. Again, there's, all of those pieces are the same. You can type the keyword Julia in the terminal and it functions the same. So these are great questions.
I found one great question by Shirsha. She just asked, would you choose Julia programming language over every other commonly used languages?
Srisha, that is a great question, and obviously I'm biased. I of course that's the sort of response that you would get from me. What I will say is that it's important to understand the reality that and I've seen this because I talk to so many people about Julia. Not everyone sort of has the bandwidth to learn Julia, to go and dive into the ecosystem. This is just a fact of nature. Like, people know you already took the time to learn Python, Java, something else. If you don't have a compelling reason, learning Julia is probably not going to happen. So really, I think there's a subset of folks who learning Julia makes a lot of sense for. I'll talk about in a couple of slides from a student perspective why I think it makes sense. But I also think there's a bunch of like industry perspectives where, if you're doing climate modeling and you're using Python and, your climate models are taking 3 days to run or something like that because it's such a computationally intensive problem, that's where I think it makes sense to take a step back and say, okay, are we using the right tool for this problem? And that's perhaps where Julia comes into the question. But Srisha, this is a great question, and it's something that people ask all the time. And again, the answer is I would, but it depends on your sort of specific context. I will give the other caveat that there are some areas, and one of the questions somebody asked, and this is the one that's actually showing up on the screen right now, does Julia support web applications? It does. This is one of the areas where I think, there's a ton of work to do still. Julia is definitely not sort of the creme de la creme web programming language right now. There's a bunch of languages that are much farther ahead, way better suited for web development. Julia has this functionality. It's just less developed at the time. So for things like that, I would say, I use Django all the time. I would say that Django is a great option. Can Julia replace Python in the long run? I think I think the future is all of these languages. I don't think that Julia will replace Python. I think just like Java was created a really long time ago, and now Java can sort of, some of the functionality of Java can be done by some of these other languages, whether it's Go or Rust or something like that. I think Python will be around in a long time. Julia will be around in a long time. And the future is sort of all of these tools still working together. Again, there's, you have the first start problem. Python has been around a long time. Python is the largest programming language in the world. For us to go in and actually replace Python, I think would be a little bit aggressive. I'm not sure that will happen, but we'll definitely all be around in the future, which is exciting.
There's one more interesting question. Like Gaurav Kumar Verma asked, what are the famous projects which are using Julia, and can we use Julia to write smart contracts? Interesting.
Very, very interesting. Somebody's been spending too much time on the blockchain Twitter communities. You definitely can. This is a good question, actually. I think the famous projects using Julia, I would go to, if you go to juliacomputing.com, there's a case studies section up at the top. Click the case studies section. There's a ton of different things. I think, I don't know if these are famous just because, who knows famous programming projects. Like, I don't know if those are like everyday things that people know. I know what some of these things are, but I'll defer to that website. I think some of the more common things, if you're familiar with the FAA, which is the organization that does like the routing and planning of airplanes in the United States, and I think they collaborate worldwide. But the software that powers, making sure that airplanes don't run into each other is written in Julia. So there's a lot of these different use cases and projects which exist in reality. So juliacomputing.com, click on the case studies up at the top, and there's like 50 examples of really cool Julia projects in production, which is awesome to see. And the smart contracts question, I'm pretty sure you can. Yeah. So I was taking a graduate level blockchain class. And one of the things that I did as part of this class was sort of explore Julia as a language from the lens of blockchain. And we were writing, we sort of were doing smart contracts. We were doing it using Solidity, sort of. So, I was looking for sort of the analog functionality, and some of that exists. It is an area where I think, you might not be able to come in right now and with a ton of ease just create smart contracts and have everything work the way you want it. There's probably some development work that still needs to happen, but it's definitely something that I think is possible. And if you want to get involved, shoot me a message and we can perhaps get that kickstarted. Is Julia object orientated? Is the question on the screen. This is a great question. So Julia it sort of has some of these object orientated ideas built in, but not object orientated in the sense that Java and C++ are. So I think the folks who created Julia, when it was created again back in 2012, they sort of saw the landscape of what Python had done with object-oriented programming. And I think in the context of Python, it really, the language isn't built for object-oriented programming. It's sort of an afterthought. And you can see that in the way that object-oriented programming is expressed in Python. So when the folks created Julia, they decided, hey, maybe we should take a sort of different approach. And this involves a few different things like structs. Structs is an object type in Julia, and it's a more lightweight version of a class. It's same thing as a sort of the same ideas as a class in that you can have attributes of a struct, you can define a constructor. The sort of key difference is that you don't write your methods inside of the struct. So Julia has a notion of multiple dispatch, which allows you to write these functions that dispatch on certain things. So in a language like Python, you can't rewrite, you can't have two functions with the same name, with the only difference being the types of the arguments. And we can perhaps look at some code later if folks have specific questions about this, because I know we're delving into the details. So Kumar, I guess the answer to your question is no, Julia is not object oriented, but it sort of supports some of these paradigms, and you can really achieve the same things as you would want to in an object oriented programming language. Does Julia support functional programming? I need to pull up a correct definition of what functional programming actually is. My guess is yes. If it's supported in Python, it's supported in Julia. I don't know if you want to provide some additional context as far as what functional programming actually means to you, and I can perhaps answer better off of that. Srisha asking the great question of the day. Two great questions, actually. So you're on fire. Is there a reason behind the language's name being what it is? No, I wish it was an interesting or cool story, but one of the folks who was one of the creators of the Julia programming language previously, actually before Jeff Bezanson is his name, before Jeff created or was a co-founder of Julia, he actually helped create another, he like wrote his own programming language and just called it Julia. And then he sort of liked that name. So when the folks came together to write what is now Julia, he actually just brought that name over from his other project, as one does when you're tinkering on multiple programming languages. And then that's sort of the name has just carried forward. But I think this is a sort of a great question. It comes with all of its challenges. Having a programming language named Julia, people refer to the language as a female because it's traditionally a female name inside of a lot of Western countries. It's not the case. Julia is there's no sort of female pronouns on the language itself. It's just a name. It's just a language. It's not named after a person or anything like that. Great question, though. Umesh is asking, in terms of use of computational mathematics, is Julia better than other languages? That, you know what, I'll sort of make a general statement. I'm not familiar in any detail with computational mathematics. If computational mathematics is about math in code, then I'll say that Julia is really well suited for applications where there's a lot of math involved. And the reason for this is because Julia, you can actually write code that is very similar to the math you would see in a paper. So if you, and there's a ton of use cases, if you go to look at Twitter and look at like hashtag JuliaLang, which is the hashtag people use to talk about Julia, there's a bunch of really great examples of someone taking a purely academic paper and then putting their Julia code next to it. And you can look at the two and see, it looks visually very similar. And that's why a lot of academics in universities and things like that who are doing research end up going with Julia, because they don't have to learn all the nuances of a language in order to express some of these ideas around math and things like that. So that's a great question. I think that Julia is very well suited for a lot of these mathematic domain problems. This is great. Tons of awesome questions. I love this. So let me knock out a couple more slides and just talk a little bit about how folks can learn Julia, and then I'll pop back. I see there's still a couple more questions coming in the comments, so I will promise that those questions will get answered. So, but again, before we started talking about questions and things like that, or answering questions, we were talking about how folks can learn Julia. And again, the people over at MIT who teach a bunch of different Julia classes have made those resources available to the world. You can participate in the class. You can go and talk to the instructors. Lots of great things like that, and that's all available to people for free on the internet. So if you're interested in that, you can go to computationalthinking.mit.edu and be a part of that class. I think, again, this is a great opportunity. Everybody loves MIT. The people there are super smart. You get a chance to engage with some of the students that are in the class, the other sort of students around the world who are taking this class. So very well done. Great opportunity. If you enjoyed the traditional classroom experience, this is the best option for you. There's also a bunch of other ways to learn Julia. If you're like, school is great, I don't necessarily want to take an online class right now. It's sort of not the most fun thing for me. I can totally understand that. If you go to the Julia Languages website, which is julialang.org, there's a learning tab up at the top, and it goes into all the details around what are the other ways that you could learn Julia, not in a traditional classroom experience. And I think there's some unique ways that you can learn Julia. So would definitely suggest checking that out if folks are interested in taking the next step. So let me really quickly answer some of these other questions. Palak is asking, what is the present scope of Julia? I think the present scope, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is Julia is really focused at the moment around a lot of problems in the scientific domain. So I would say Julia is being less so used for some of these, basic or sort of general purpose programming problems. it can solve those problems. There's nothing fundamentally that's stopping it from solving those problems. But again, right now, the focus, just because of the domains that Julia is well suited for, the focus, I think, from the community and such is around these scientific computing ideas. So great question. Hopefully that helps answer. And if not, feel free to post a follow-up in the comments. The other question I see is, how is Julia better than other ML programming languages? This is an excellent question. I think, one of the sort of dirty secrets around some of the other programming, environments and packages and languages and things like that is, if you take a look at PyTorch, for example, or TensorFlow, or some of these other languages and frameworks that exist, it's not actually written in Python. There's there's an abstraction layer, which is the Python code that you see and perhaps the functions that you use. But under the hood, what it is C++ code. So if you want to go and make a contribution to one of these ecosystems, you really need to know C++. You don't need to know Python. I mean, you need to know Python, but you also need to know C++. And I think from a development standpoint, this presents a whole bunch of problems. It really is a fundamental challenge to have this sort of paradigm in that you have these two languages and the challenges that come up with that. Julia and the Flux ecosystem, which is the Julia machine learning package. If you go to, I think it's like fluxml.ai is the website. If you look at the Julia machine learning package, it is 100% Julia code. There's no hidden layer of, we're calling a bunch of C++ functions under the hood or something like that. It's all Julia. And what this means for you as a developer and a user of this package is, if you understand Julia, you can understand the internals of how the Flux package actually works. And you can go and make changes and do a lot of these customizations that enable you to take your sort of machine learning workflow to the next level. And again, this use case is not sort of what I would say the general purpose use cases. In general, PyTorch, TensorFlow, all these packages work really well. Out of the box, it works great. But when you want to sort of take things to the next level and move past the sort of initial use cases and sort of the fundamental basics, that's where you might run into some of these problems with things being in C++ and the performance challenges and all that stuff. So I think that's what makes Julia better suited. And again, the speed and reproducibility aspect from a machine learning standpoint, incredibly important. If your machine learning code isn't reproducible, there's no reason to write it in the first place. Like, no one can use people don't necessarily want to take your word that you have some great machine learning application or problem solved. If they can't run the code themselves, it doesn't really help anybody. So again, Julia sort of has all these ideas in mind. Great question. Srisha coming in with another question. What would you say is the USP of Julia? I don't know what USP stands for, so feel free to put that into the chat. Another question, how different are the syntaxes of Python and Julia? I would go and look at some of the code examples in Julia. I think the syntax is very similar. So I actually probably program more in Python than I do in Julia, and I never have a problem sort of transitioning back and forth between the two because the syntax is so familiar. So definitely I would go on julialang.org or Google some examples and see what the syntax looks like. It should be quite similar to Python. Any other questions that?
So we have one more question from Sanya. Does previous experience with other programming languages make it easier to learn Julia?
Sanya, this is a good question. Does previous experience with other programming languages make it easier to learn Julia? I think as a general principle, learning your second or third language, I think learning your second language is hard. Learning your third language should be easier. So if you already know a few programming languages, learning Julia should not be a challenge. Again, there's all the resources exist for you. But I think folks in general probably have the most difficulty learning their second language, and that's just because you only know one language, you're familiar with the paradigms in that language, and as soon as you learn something different, you're like, wait a second, this is not the way that it was done in that other programming language. This doesn't make sense. So it's easy to sort of get caught up on the second language, but I do think it definitely makes it easier. But there's also a bunch of great resources if you don't know another programming language and are sort of a nervous beginner, if you will. We have a course specifically designed for people learning Julia who have sort of maybe tried programming in another language. It didn't work out. They sort of stepped away and now want to give programming another chance in Julia. In Julia is their default approach that can help programmers to enhance their performance. So one of the really great things about Julia is that the performance improvement comes out of the box. So there's definitely some things that you can do to improve the performance. And if you check out the Julia documentation, the core documentation, there's actually a section that talks about, what can you do to your code to improve the performance. But in general, out of the box as a language itself, Julia will be faster than some of the other use cases without actually having to write any special code. So the speed is built into the language itself. You don't have to play any of these like tricks in order to get things to be as fast as you want them to be.
So Milind has asked a question that we have previously answered. Does Julia support web applications also?
Yeah, we answered that question before. It does support them, but I would say that the ecosystem in some of these other languages is more robust. The question on the screen right now is compiler latency had been a common issue in Julia. What's your opinion on it? This is a good question. I don't have a ton of background and context around the way that compilers work and specifically the stuff that's happening in the Julia domain. What I would say is that the people that I know who are doing compiler stuff in the Julia domain are the smartest people that I know. So I have a ton of faith that they're going to continue to do all the compiler things that they know how to do and are making Julia as fast as it is. So I think it might be a common issue right now, but I literally have zero doubt or fear that it's going to continue to be a problem in the issue. The people working on that problem and all the compiler stuff are just so smart that again, I have no doubt that it's going to be solved. Although Julia is a high-level language, can you give one reason due to which even beginners can handle tasks with it? So, Rohit, I'm not sure if I understand your question, but if I'm reading it correctly, you're asking how folks can get started with Julia, perhaps, given that it's a high-level language.
Yeah, even though a high-level language, yeah, that's the same question. Like how the beginners can get started with Julia.
Yeah, good question. Again, I would suggest that MIT course if you want to learn through a traditional classroom experience. Otherwise, the Julia language website learning tab up at the top, give that a click. There's a bunch of different ways you can get a mentor to help you learn Julia, all that sort of stuff. So definitely beginners can handle things in Julia. It's not overbearing. It's things are pretty lightweight and you should be able to do it. I believe in you, Rohit. So Rohit, if you're not learning Julia soon, I'll be around and I'm gonna find out. So let me know if you have questions. So I think those are great questions to ask.
So Pranav's question is a bit interesting. What is the memory architecture behind Julia and how literals are addressed to the memory? Is it similar to the garbage collection of Python?
Interesting question, Pranav. Again, I would say that a lot of the work that I do in the Julia domain is sort of one level above sort of the compiler and a lot of these different sort of lower level architecture things. So I don't actually have a good understanding of the way that garbage collection happens. I will say that garbage collection exists in Julia. It's a JIT compiled programming language, so garbage collection is super important. I just don't know the actual architecture? This is a really good question, though. Honestly, if you want to do me a favor and post this on the Julia discourse and tag me, I'm interested to see what the answer is, because again, I don't know the answer to this question. So discourse.julialang.org, post it, tag me. I'll make sure the right people see it. And great question. I'd love to see the answer, because I don't know what the answer is. Kumar's asking, can Julia work on distributed computing? 100%. One of the premier use cases for Julia is in the use case of distributed computing. So I think there's actually we have a course or some materials around distributed computing in Julia. So definitely exists, definitely works, and is something that that you can do today.
So Mayank is asking, in the terms of the community support, how well does Julia fare with JavaScript and Python?
I'm biased because I'm the community manager for the Julia language, so I have high things to say about Julia. I do think that it is completely fair to note that the Python community and the JavaScript community are way bigger than the Julia community. There's obviously a ton of people in the Julia community, and it's growing rapidly, like 100% every year, which is awesome to see. But Python has like 36% market share of all of the programming languages used in existence. So it's not an apt comparison between those two languages. I think that this is, despite that, it's one of the things that I think is special about the Julia community right now. And I think for folks getting involved in the Julia ecosystem, you see the benefit of this, in that you can go on Slack, you can go on Discourse, ask a question, and like talk to someone who helped write the Julia language. I think this is super cool. And it's one of the things that I feel like I'm part of this actual community of people. Even before I started as the community manager, like I would just talk to these people and ask them questions. And that's something that I think is unique to the Julia community right now. And that's just because of the size. Once you scale up to, 20 million, 50 million developers, you sort of lose that ability. So it's fun right now that we all get to be a part of this close community. Rohit's coming in with the hard ones, trying to get me to misstep and identify some disadvantages. Now, I think one of the challenges with Julia is, and we sort of talked about this in the domain of web development and things like that. I think it's not a disadvantage of Julia as a tool or an ecosystem. I think one of the challenges that we face as a community is that, again, a lot of the people doing Julia stuff are focused around the scientific domains. So if you want to go and do some of these more general purpose applications, like building a Slack bot or something like that, like that sort of stuff is less done in the Julia community right now, just because people are so focused on these scientific computing domains. So I think that's one of the disadvantages of our current makeup is, we haven't explored that area a ton. So people coming from other domains, if that's of interest to you, there's a ton of impact that can be made in those sort of general computing areas. It's a good question, though, Rohit. I would also say, give it a try out Julia, see what the challenges you have are. I think it probably is different for everybody, depending on the use case and also depending on your sort of experience as well.
So Martin Luke is asking, if I have any doubt when starting Julia, then how can I contact community?
Yeah, great question, Martin. There's a bunch of different ways. Stack Overflow is one. I think everyone knows the challenge with Stack Overflow. The moderators are evil, and everyone wants to downvote your question if you misspell a word. So those are sort of the normal challenges of Stack Overflow. I don't have a fix for that. I think Discourse, Julia has its own Discourse platform, which is just a Q&A platform similar to Stack Overflow. The URL is just discourse.julialang.org. Post your question on there. Ton of people active all the time, so you'll get an answer if you have challenges or questions or things like that. That's probably the best place to ask.
So Rohit again is asking, MATLAB provides same experience as Julia in terms of computational programming. So why use Julia?
Rohit, do you like paying for your programming languages? Are you crazy, man? I mean, I guess that's the MATLAB has done a ton of incredible stuff. They have a bunch of really great services and specific products built around MATLAB, like the visualization for building circuits and things like that. All of that stuff, state of the art, very specific and done extremely well in the case of MATLAB. I think as a general purpose programming language, you can't use MATLAB for the same stuff that you use Julia for. And having to buy a license does not scale up to hundreds of millions of developers. So I think there's a bunch of fundamental challenges that MATLAB has. And you'll sort of see Julia fighting, tooth and nail against MATLAB because of these things. I think if MATLAB was open source, available to everyone in the world, you wouldn't see as much of a challenge for them. But that's just not the way that math works as a business runs. They're selling licenses to the language. So maybe if you have a lot of money, Rohit, then MATLAB might be no, I'm just kidding. MATLAB is still, I think, again, from a performance standpoint as well, you see this. And Rohit, the last piece that I'll say is go check out the Julia Computing website. Go and look at those case studies. There's a bunch of specific case studies where folks at Pfizer actually were using, before they started working with Puma's AI, they were using MATLAB for a lot of their pharmaceutical simulations. And when they switched to Julia, they saw a 175x improvement in speed. And obviously, I'll make the disclaimer, you're not going to see that speed improvement on every application. It depends specifically on how your code is written and things like that. But that is a fact that they saw that much improvement making the transition from MATLAB to Julia. So Rohit, if you like 175x speed improvements, Julia might be a tool to consider.
So I guess the questions are over for now.
Yeah, there's so many good questions. So I love this. This is awesome. Usually folks don't ask as many good questions. So I'm glad we have folks engaged right now. But really quickly, I'll talk about some of the features that I love about Julia. One of them is the package manager, and I'll show a really quick demo of this in a second. But the package manager is just a night and day difference in the package management and things like that versus some of the other languages like Python. Like pip in the Python ecosystem just does not work. I'm confused as to why that is the de facto tool and how things haven't been improved in the Python ecosystem. But it really is just not, it's as good as it can be. But I think Julia has all these improvements in the package manager ecosystem. And these are the sort of quality of life things that over time, like I run into this challenge a lot in my own personal development. It's super challenging to manage these package dependencies, especially in like a real world work context. Like if someone sends you code and it's supposed to work and it doesn't work, like that's just such an annoying thing to deal with. And then you're trying to figure out like what Python package did this person use in order to do whatever it is that they're doing. So and again, we talked about the speed and reproducibility already. So let's look at a really quick demo of the package manager. So this is a Julia terminal session. You can enter into the package manager in Julia by typing a left-facing square bracket. And when you do that, it tells you the Julia version. It tells you you're in the package manager via changing the color and with the little PKG thing. And then you can just say the words add and then the name of the package that you want to add in Julia. So in this case, I'm adding the Stack Overflow package. And during this demo, I, of course, spelled it wrong. So you have to show, not always typing things right and what that might look like. But you can see a bunch of stuff and it's telling you what's been installed and things like that. But we'll see the cool part in a second. And I'm glad I cleared up some of the doubts about Julia and hopefully you've been convinced. So it's compiling all the different stuff, getting things ready for us to actually use the package that I've gone and installed, and we'll look at some other of the commands in a second and see what, from a Python perspective, nothing has really been fundamentally different yet. I just sort of pip installed. But now one of the key things that you just saw is typing the status keyword. This tells me the name of the file where I can find all the packages that are installed. Typing the help command shows me all the different commands I can run. Going back to the status command, you can see the names of all the packages that are installed, the versions of all these things. It's just, again, such a fundamentally different package experience than exists in the Python domain. So something that I think for me in my own development, this is one of the, it sounds like a small issue, but you go into a sort of corporate context and this issue is extremely prolific. So something to keep in mind. So this sort of takes us to the next question as far as how folks can get involved. So everything we've talked about so far has been like just using the language as a developer. I also think there's a ton of really great opportunities for folks to come in and contribute to the language. And you see the sort of three traditional areas where folks can come in and contribute. You have a code contribution to a package or something like that. That's what I would say is sort of farther down the line. What I would suggest for folks, and this is more general advice and not necessarily specific to Julia, but a lot of people in the open source space and students are like, okay, I want to go and contribute to open source. That means I have to go and, open a pull request to do something crazy and add some new functionality to this massive package. And that's just not the case. Like, that's not the first thing that you're going to want to do in your open source journey and your journey learning Julia as a language. Go and do some of these other things first. Become comfortable, and it's sort of the natural progression. Like, even for myself right now, I've been programming in Julia for like 3 years or something like that. I don't just go and make, massive pull requests to some new technical idea. Like, that's just not the way. And I have the skill set perhaps to do that, but I still have to go and do all these other things. I have to go and make the non-technical contributions and the documentation contributions. And all of those things help shape my understanding and make it so that if I wanted to, and there's the specific use case to do so, I can go and make a quality code contribution to one of these projects. But don't feel like that has to be the first thing that you do. There's a whole slew of other things that you can do from a contribution standpoint that are sort of less, they're not code contributions. And this was just, again, to sort of motivate some of this conversation. This is some of the quotes that I found from an article in Forbes talking about what is the specific things employers are looking for when they're hiring students fresh out of college. And again, I don't want to say that these things are specific to learning Julia. That would be naive. That's not true. I think Julia is a great use case for this. There's a whole bunch of other tools. So even perhaps if Julia isn't the tool and you're like, I'm not convinced, don't want to learn it, there's another tool out there where the same principles will apply. I think, being self-motivated, learning a new tool sort of knocks out the first point. Offering a fresh perspective when you're being hired at a company to do a job, when you're fresh out of school, the reality is you're not being hired because you're the smartest person with the most expertise in the entire world. You're being hired to offer a fresh perspective. That's the whole point, that they would hire someone fresh out of school who just learned about all the new cutting edge technology, is so that they can get that perspective from you. If they wanted someone with 15 years of experience, they would have gone and hired that person. So that there's a specific reason students are being hired for different roles. So I think learning something like Julia or some other analog tool that's sort of cutting edge, growing rapidly, gives you that real world out of the classroom experience that you see mentioned at the bottom. And open source and some of these other tools are just a perfect way of doing this. So I would highly suggest, again, if at least I've convinced Martin's going to learn Julia and be able to take advantage of these things. But if not Julia, I would say, honestly, there's another tool out there. Find whatever that tool is. This will serve you extremely well, sort of in the growth and trajectory of your career. I truly believe that. I've seen this for myself. So it's a firsthand experience for me. But that's pretty much everything I have. Again, I mentioned all these things before. I'll mention them again. The community aspect of Julia is one of the greatest sort of benefits and features of the language itself. I think you also have this notion of the career progression when you're learning these new tools and being able to talk about them. I'll give one slight one really quick story, and I think it was such an interesting experience for me when I was interviewing at Shopify for an internship experience a couple of years ago, and the Shopify internship experience, they like ask you to send them some of your code ahead of time, and then you like go through it with the interviewers. And I sent them some of my Julia code, and we walked through it during the interview. And these interviewers had never heard of Julia. So it was such a cool opportunity for me to sort of share all of this knowledge that I had accumulated and tell them about, what is Julia? Why would they want to use it? Sort of the same things that we're talking about today, except in an interview setting. And and I'll make the note that didn't actually get the internship. So maybe this isn't true, but what I think is that, it was from their perspective, it was great to hear all these things from me. They really got to see like what my actual understanding was, because I was explaining to them a completely new tool which they knew nothing about. So I think that's such an advantage for folks, and something that's worth keeping in mind as far as learning in your career and stuff goes. So that's what I have. Hopefully this helps folks and people are excited and interested. Any other last minute questions? I'm not sure if we're at time, because we were a little bit late to start, but any other questions from folks in the chat?
I don't think they have any more questions, but rather they are very astonished that you conducted this type of session.
I'm glad that people enjoyed it. I think I had a ton of fun doing these. I think especially when people ask a bunch of great questions, and I forgot who it was that asked the question about garbage collection, but make sure you post that onto the Julia discourse, and I'm excited to see what the answer to that is, and I'm sure we're going to get some insight from all the super smart compiler people, and it'll be great. I'm happy this happened. I got to learn a bunch of stuff as well, so it'll be fun. Martin says, I am starting Julia and Shopify gets my application. Yeah, give it a shot. See, maybe the interviewer people have warmed up to Julia code, and they didn't think that I was crazy for showing them this new tool and a bunch of different stuff. So Martin, I'm excited for you. Good luck at Shopify, and let me know if you have any questions about learning Julia. Yeah, I don't see any other questions.
So let's end it, I guess, then.
Yeah, this was great. I appreciate being here, and I think it was a ton of fun. So thank you both.
So thank you, everyone. Do stay connected for the DaeDarus has more events such as speaker sessions, mini events, and all. And again, we have very great sponsors like Zava Labs and AI, Rahi, and they are conducting their own challenges and sponsoring us. So do look out for that also in the Discord channels. We are great to have you.
Yeah, Rohit, shoot me a message on Twitter if you have questions about getting started. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Just search Logan Kilpatrick. You'll find my Twitter. And Martin, if you want to talk about Shopify stuff, shoot me a message and suggest some docs and things like that. Yeah, I'll send them to you or just julialang.org/contribute has a bunch of stuff there as well.
Yeah, I guess then we are closing. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, take care, everyone. See ya.
See you. Bye-bye.